Hey there, welcome to Mr. Cozy Bedtime True Crime Stories. Tonight, we're diving into 2 hours of gripping true crime cases. Real stories of mystery, betrayal, and cold-blooded crimes, all set against the soothing backdrop of rain. It's the perfect blend of calm and unsettling. If these cases draw you in, tap that like button, share with your fellow true crime lovers, and subscribe to join our curious community. I'm always wondering, where are you tuning in from, and what time is it for you right now? Drop it in the comments below. Now settle in, and let's dig into the darkness. Story 1. The morning of November 10th, 2025, began like countless other mornings in the quiet neighborhood on New Oak Lane in Huntersville, North Carolina. The houses sat tucked among mature trees in a comfortable suburb just north of Charlotte, where families raised children and couples settled into the rhythms of middle age. Inside one of these homes, 54-year-old Susan Michelle Perry and her 58-year-old husband Robert Joe Perry were about to have a confrontation that would end in death. The couple had been married for years, sharing a life that from the outside appeared stable and ordinary. Joe worked, Susan managed their home, and they existed in the kind of comfortable routine that defines many long marriages. But beneath that surface normalcy, something had been fracturing for some time, tensions building in ways that Susan may not have fully recognized until it was too late to change course. Joe Perry had reached a decision. He wanted a divorce. The marriage wasn't working anymore, and he had decided it was time to end it. On the evening of November 9th, 2025, Joe told Susan what he had been thinking, what he had decided. He wanted out of their marriage. He wanted to start over, to build a life that didn't include her anymore. For Susan, this news must have felt like the ground opening beneath her feet. She was 54 years old, with no independent income, no career of her own, financially dependent on the man who was now telling her he was leaving. The argument that night was heated, voices raised in the way that happens when people realize their lives are about to change in ways they can't control. The next morning, November 10th, the argument resumed. Joe and Susan stood in the hallway of their home, continuing the fight that had started the night before. The words were angry, desperate, each person trying to make the other understand their position, their pain, their needs. And then Joe turned and walked into his home office, perhaps seeking space, perhaps trying to end the conversation. Susan followed him. Inside the office, the argument escalated further. And then Joe grabbed a gun. Shortly before 1 o'clock in the afternoon on November 10th, 2025, the Huntersville Police Department received a 911 call from the Perry residence on New Oak Lane. The call was logged as a suicide attempt. Susan Michelle Perry was on the line, reporting that something terrible had happened to her husband. When officers from the Huntersville Police Department arrived at the home, they found a scene that appeared to support Susan's initial report. In Joe Perry's home office, the 58-year-old man lay on his back on the floor, a gunshot wound to the center of his chest. Susan was kneeling on the ground near him, and a gun rested on a nearby table. First responders immediately began life-saving measures, working desperately to save Joe's life. But the wound was too severe, the damage too extensive. Despite their efforts, Robert Joe Perry was pronounced dead. Susan told the responding officers what had happened, or at least what she claimed had happened. She said she had heard a thud, like the sound of someone falling. When she went into Joe's office to check on him, she found him lying on his side with blood spreading around him. Panicked, she had called 911 immediately. The story Susan told was consistent with suicide. A man alone in his office, a gunshot, his wife discovering him after hearing the sound of his fall. It was tragic but not uncommon, especially for middle-aged men facing life transitions or crises. The initial assessment classified Joe's death as a suicide attempt that had succeeded. But experienced homicide investigators know that initial impressions can be deceiving, and that the stories people tell in the immediate aftermath of a death aren't always the complete truth. The Huntersville Police Department began a thorough investigation into Joe Perry's death, and what they discovered would completely change the narrative Susan had presented. As part of their standard investigation into Joe's death, detectives obtained Susan Michelle Perry's cell phone and downloaded its contents. What they found there immediately raised suspicions about Susan's account of her husband's suicide. Susan's internet search history told a very different story than the one she had given police. In the days or weeks before Joe's death, Susan had been conducting Google searches that suggested she was thinking about what would happen if her husband died and how much she might benefit financially. The search history showed that Susan had looked up how much her husband's wedding ring was worth, a question that seems innocuous on its surface, but takes on a darker meaning when viewed in the context of his subsequent death. She had also searched for information about what to do if your husband wants a divorce and you have no money. This search directly connected to the argument Susan would later admit she and Joe had been having about his desire to end their marriage. But the most damning search in Susan's history was one that seemed impossible to explain away as innocent curiosity or coincidence. Susan had Googled the term center mass shots. In firearms training and tactical instruction, center mass refers to aiming for the center of a person's torso, specifically the chest area where vital organs are located. It's the target area taught to law enforcement and military personnel because a shot to center mass is most likely to immediately incapacitate or kill a target. Joe Perry had been shot once in the center of his chest, exactly where a center mass shot would strike. The placement of the wound aligned perfectly with what Susan had been researching on her phone. These searches painted a picture that directly contradicted Susan's story of walking into Joe's office and finding him after he had shot himself. Instead, they suggested premeditation, planning, research into how to kill someone, and what financial resources might be available afterward. Based on the evidence they had gathered from Susan's phone and their continuing investigation into the circumstances of Joe's death, detectives from the Huntersville Police Department asked Susan to come to the police station for a second interview on February 6, 2026, nearly 3 months after her husband's death. During this interview, Susan's story changed dramatically. She no longer maintained that she had simply found Joe after he shot himself. Instead, she told investigators a new version of events, one that acknowledged her presence in the room when the gun went off but still portrayed her as a victim rather than a perpetrator. Susan told detectives that she and Joe had argued on the night of November 9th because he had told her he wanted a divorce. The next morning, November 10th, the argument had resumed in their hallway, and then Susan had followed Joe into his home office. According to Susan's new account, Joe had grabbed a gun while they were in the office. However, she said he held it normally and wasn't pointing it at her or at himself. Susan claimed that she became scared that Joe might fire the weapon, so she grabbed it, and the two of them started struggling over the gun. Susan said that while she was still holding the gun during this struggle, it went off, and Joe was struck in the chest. She was now admitting that she had been holding the gun when it discharged, that her finger had been on the trigger when the shot that killed her husband was fired. But even this new version of events was riddled with inconsistencies and contradictions. Detectives noted that Susan made several statements that didn't align with each other or with the physical evidence. She gave conflicting accounts about how long she had waited before calling 911 after Joe was shot, changing the timeline in ways that suggested she was trying to construct a narrative rather than simply recounting what had actually happened. Susan also provided inconsistent information about whether she had tried to administer first aid to Joe after he was shot. In some versions of her story, she had attempted to help him, in others, she hadn't. And her explanation of where she had put the gun after Joe was shot also varied depending on when and how she was asked. The medical examiner's report provided crucial information that helped investigators understand what had really happened in Joe Perry's office on November 10, 2025. The autopsy determined that Joe had been shot at close range, with the gun positioned near his body when it was fired. This finding was significant because it aligned with the physical positioning that would have existed during Susan's claimed struggle over the gun. If Joe and Susan had indeed been fighting over the weapon, and it had discharged while Susan was holding it, the close-range nature of the wound would be consistent with that scenario. However, the close-range finding also aligned with another possibility, that Susan had intentionally shot Joe at close range, perhaps while he was unarmed and unprepared to defend himself. The medical evidence alone couldn't definitively prove which scenario had occurred. What the medical evidence could definitively prove was that Joe Perry had been shot in the center of his chest, in what firearms experts would recognize as a center mass shot, the same type of shot that Susan had been researching on her phone before her husband's death. The precision of the wound placement, combined with Susan's internet searches, suggested knowledge and preparation rather than the panic and chaos of a struggle. On February 6, 2026, after Susan's second interview with detectives, the Huntersville Police Department made the decision to arrest her. Nearly 3 months after Robert Joe Perry's death, his wife was charged with first-degree murder. The arrest warrant and accompanying affidavit laid out the evidence against Susan Michelle Perry in stark detail. The document described how Susan had initially claimed to have found Joe after he shot himself, then changed her story months later to claim they had struggled over the gun. It outlined the inconsistencies in her various statements to police. And most damning of all, it detailed the internet searches on Susan's phone that showed she had been researching her husband's financial worth, her options if he divorced her while she had no money, and how to shoot someone in the center mass. Susan Michelle Perry was booked into the Mecklenburg County Jail, where she was held on a bond of $150,000. As part of her conditions of detention, the court ordered that Susan undergo a mental health assessment. Her next court hearing was scheduled for February 27, 2026. As Susan Michelle Perry sits in the Mecklenburg County Jail awaiting her next court appearance, many questions about what happened on November 10, 2025, remain unanswered. What exactly transpired in Joe Perry's home office that morning? Was it truly a struggle over a gun that accidentally discharged, as Susan now claims? Or was it a deliberate, planned shooting by a woman who had been researching how to kill her husband and what she would do after he was gone? The prosecution will likely argue that Susan's internet searches show clear premeditation. They will point to her research about center mass shots and argue that the precise placement of the wound in Joe's chest proves Susan knew exactly where to aim. They will highlight her searches about what to do if her husband wanted a divorce and she had no money, suggesting a financial motive for murder. And they will emphasize the inconsistencies in Susan's various statements to police, arguing that an innocent person's story doesn't change dramatically over time. The defense will likely argue that Susan was a frightened woman whose husband grabbed a gun during an argument, forcing her to defend herself. They may claim that her internet searches were innocent expressions of worry about her financial future if Joe divorced her, not evidence of murder planning. And they will argue that Susan's changing statements to police reflect the trauma and confusion of having been involved in her husband's death, not consciousness of guilt. The medical evidence showing that Joe was shot at close range could support either interpretation. If Susan and Joe were struggling over the gun, they would have been close together when it fired. But if Susan walked up to Joe and shot him deliberately, he would also have been at close range. The key question for a jury will be whether they believe Susan's story of a struggle that ended in an accidental shooting, or whether they believe the prosecution's theory that Susan researched how to kill her husband, waited for the right moment during an argument, and deliberately shot him in the chest when he told her he wanted a divorce. Robert Joe Perry was 58 years old when he died. He had lived more than half a century, built a career, married, made a home on New Oak Lane in Huntersville. He had reached a point in his life where he wanted something different, wanted to start over, wanted the freedom that comes with ending a marriage that no longer works. He told his wife he wanted a divorce on November 9, 2025. Less than 24 hours later, he was dead from a gunshot wound to the chest. Whether his death was the accidental result of a struggle over a gun or the intentional act of a wife who didn't want to face divorce remains to be determined by the criminal justice system. Susan Michelle Perry, 54 years old when arrested, now faces first-degree murder charges that could result in decades in prison if she is convicted. She has not yet entered a plea, and her attorney has not publicly commented on the case. It remains unclear whether Susan will ultimately claim self-defense, argue that the shooting was accidental, or maintain some other version of events. What is clear is that the internet searches on Susan's phone have become the most significant evidence in the case against her. In the digital age, the searches we conduct on our phones and computers leave permanent records of our thoughts, our plans, our fears, and sometimes our intentions. Susan Michelle Perry searched for information about center mass shots, about her husband's financial worth, about what to do if he wanted a divorce and she had no money. Those searches, combined with Joe Perry's death from a single shot to the center of his chest during an argument about divorce, have led prosecutors to charge her with his murder. As February 27, 2026, approaches and Susan Perry prepares for her next court appearance, the community of Huntersville watches and waits to see how this case will unfold. A man is dead, a woman is charged with his murder, and the truth of what happened in that home office on New Oak Lane remains contested, known perhaps only to Susan herself. The case of Susan Michelle Perry stands as a stark reminder that domestic arguments can escalate in terrible ways, that the decision to end a marriage can sometimes trigger violence, and that in the digital age, our online searches may ultimately tell a story about us that we never intended to reveal. Story 2. The summer heat had not yet fully surrendered to autumn on that late August night in 2014, when Christina Morris decided to drive from Fort Worth back to her old hometown of Plano, Texas. She had moved away 3 months earlier to be closer to her boyfriend Hunter Foster, but the pull of old friendships remained strong. When her friends invited her to come out for a night of catching up before Labor Day weekend drew to a close, Christina did not hesitate. At 23 years old, Christina carried herself with the kind of confidence that came from knowing who she was. Her blonde hair framed a face that lit up easily with laughter, and she had a way of making everyone around her feel included and valued. She was petite but spirited, the kind of person who could walk into a room and immediately lift the mood. Those who knew her spoke of her warmth, her loyalty, and the infectious energy she brought to any gathering. On that particular Friday evening, she was looking forward to spending time with people she had grown up with, people who knew her history and shared her memories. The plan was simple and familiar. Meet up with friends at an apartment in the Shops at Legacy, an upscale shopping and restaurant complex in Plano where many young professionals lived and socialized. The Shops at Legacy had the atmosphere of a place designed for leisure and connection, with its wide walkways, outdoor dining areas, and modern apartments perched above retail spaces. It felt safe, well-lit, and full of life, especially on weekend nights when groups of friends moved between apartments, restaurants, and bars. Christina arrived around 9 in the evening on August 29th, joining a small group of friends who had gathered to drink, talk, and enjoy each other's company. The night unfolded as such nights often do. Conversation flowed easily, music played in the background, drinks were poured, and laughter punctuated stories about work, relationships, and plans for the future. Christina texted back and forth with her boyfriend Hunter throughout the evening, keeping him updated on how the night was going and when she might head home. Among the friends gathered that night was Enrique Aroki, a name from Christina's past. He had attended the same high school as Christina, though they had never been particularly close. Aroki was 24 years old, living in the area, and had been invited to the gathering by mutual friends. He and Christina were acquaintances rather than close friends, the kind of people who recognized each other and could exchange pleasantries, but did not share deep connections or frequent contact. As the hours slipped past midnight and into the early morning of August 30th, the group gradually began to thin. People decided it was time to head home, to get some sleep before the holiday weekend continued. Christina received a text from Hunter, and she told her friends it was time for her to leave as well. Her car, a Toyota Celica, was parked in the parking garage attached to the Shops at Legacy, and she prepared to make the drive back to Fort Worth. Aroki was also getting ready to leave, and when he learned that Christina was heading to her car, he offered to walk with her. It was a gesture that seemed courteous on the surface. The parking garage could be quiet and isolated in the early morning hours, and walking together seemed safer than walking alone. Christina's friends thought little of it. Aroki's car was parked in the same garage, and the two were headed in the same direction. At approximately 3:55 in the morning, surveillance cameras captured the two of them entering the parking garage together. The footage showed Christina wearing a distinctive black hat, a skirt, and sandals, her figure small and recognizable as she walked beside Aroki, who was dressed in a black long-sleeved shirt and dark pants. They moved through the camera's field of view, heading deeper into the structure where rows of parked cars sat silent in the dim lighting. The parking garage was quiet at that hour, with most of the complex's residents and visitors already home or long gone. 3 minutes later, at 3:58 in the morning, surveillance cameras captured Aroki's vehicle leaving the parking garage. He drove away into the night, the taillights of his car disappearing as he headed toward his own home. Christina's Toyota Celica, however, never moved. It remained in the same spot where she had parked it hours earlier, untouched and undisturbed, as the minutes and then hours passed and the sun began to rise over Plano. At first, no one noticed that anything was wrong. It was Labor Day weekend, a time when people's schedules shifted, when plans changed, and when it was not unusual for someone to stay over at a friend's place or sleep in after a late night. Hunter tried to reach Christina throughout the day on Saturday, sending texts and making calls that went unanswered. At first he assumed she was sleeping, recovering from the late night. But as the hours stretched on and Christina's phone remained silent, his concern began to grow. Christina's mother, Joni Hare, also tried to reach her daughter over the weekend. When calls went straight to voicemail and text messages were not returned, a cold unease settled in. Christina was responsible and communicative. She did not simply disappear without explanation. By Sunday, the unease had turned into alarm. Joni and other family members began calling Christina's friends, asking if anyone had seen or heard from her. The responses only deepened their worry. No one had seen Christina since she left the gathering early Saturday morning. On Tuesday, September 2nd, 2014, 3 days after Christina was last seen, her family contacted the Plano Police Department to report her missing. Officers responded immediately, recognizing the seriousness of the situation. A young woman who had been out with friends and was supposed to drive home had simply vanished, leaving her car behind and her phone inactive. There were no signs of a voluntary disappearance. Christina had not withdrawn money from her bank account, had not posted on social media, and had not contacted anyone. Everything about the case suggested that something had gone terribly wrong. Investigators began by reviewing the surveillance footage from the shops at Legacy. The cameras had captured Christina and Aroki entering the parking garage together, and they had captured Aroki leaving alone just minutes later. Christina, however, was never seen exiting the garage. Her car remained in its parking spot, locked and undamaged. The implication was clear. Something had happened to Christina inside that parking garage, and Enrique Aroki was the last person known to have been with her. Detectives brought Aroki in for questioning. He told them a straightforward story. He and Christina had walked into the parking garage together, but they had separated once inside. He said he had gone to his own car and driven home, and that was the last time he had seen her. He suggested that perhaps Christina had encountered someone else in the garage, or that she had decided to leave with someone else. His tone was cooperative, his manner calm, and his explanation plausible on the surface. Yet as detectives dug deeper, inconsistencies began to emerge. They examined cell phone records, tracing the pings that Christina's phone had sent to nearby cell towers in the hours after she disappeared. Those pings told a story that contradicted Aroki's account. Instead of showing that Christina and Aroki had separated in the parking garage, the data indicated that Christina's phone had traveled with Aroki's phone, moving away from the shops at Legacy and heading north, in the direction of Aroki's home. The phones remained in close proximity for a period of time before Christina's phone went silent, as if it had been turned off or destroyed. Investigators obtained a warrant to search Hiroki's vehicle, a Chevrolet Camaro. What they found was damning. Inside the trunk of the car, forensic technicians discovered DNA that matched Christina Morris. It was not a stray hair or an easily explained transfer. It was evidence that indicated Christina had been in the trunk of Hiroki's car. The discovery changed the trajectory of the investigation. Christina's presence in Hiroki's trunk could not be explained away by innocent contact or casual interaction. It suggested that she had been taken against her will, that she had been placed in a confined space where a person would only be if they were being transported without their consent. The evidence pointed toward abduction, and possibly something far worse. Detectives also searched Hiroki's home and examined his trash. Among the discarded items, they found a handwritten list that included references to getting rid of evidence. The black shirt he had been wearing the night Christina disappeared, and text messages from his phone on August 29th and 30th. The list suggested a deliberate effort to destroy or conceal anything that might link him to Christina's disappearance. Friends who had been at the gathering that night were interviewed, and they provided additional context. Several people mentioned that Hiroki had seemed interested in Christina, that he had displayed what they described as romantic feelings toward her. Those feelings, however, had not been reciprocated. Christina was in a committed relationship with Hunter, and she had not shown any interest in pursuing anything with Hiroki. One witness recalled that Hiroki had seemed angry or agitated when he left with Christina, a detail that added another layer to the picture investigators were building. On December 13, 2014, more than 3 months after Christina disappeared, Plano police arrested Enrique Hiroki and charged him with aggravated kidnapping. It was a significant step, but it also highlighted a painful reality. Christina's body had not been found. Without a body, without a crime scene that definitively showed what had happened to her, the case would rest heavily on circumstantial and forensic evidence. For Christina's family, the arrest brought a mixture of relief and anguish. They believed that Hiroki knew what had happened to their daughter, that he held the key to bringing her home. Every week, during jail visitation hours, family members stood outside the facility, hoping that Hiroki's parents would hear their pleas and convince their son to tell the truth. But Hiroki remained silent, maintaining his story that he and Christina had parted ways in the parking garage, and that he had no knowledge of what had happened to her after that. The case went to trial in September 2016, nearly 2 years after Christina vanished. The Collin County courtroom was filled with family members, friends, reporters, and members of the community who had followed the case closely. The prosecution laid out the timeline of that night, using surveillance footage, cell phone records, and DNA evidence to build their argument. They showed jurors the video of Christina and Hiroki entering the parking garage, and the video of Hiroki leaving alone. They presented the cell tower data that placed Christina's phone traveling with Hiroki's. And they presented the forensic evidence, Christina's DNA in the trunk of Hiroki's car. The defense attempted to counter each piece of evidence, arguing that cell tower pings were unreliable and could not definitively place two phones together. They suggested that Christina's DNA could have been transferred to the trunk through secondary contact, that it could have been contaminated in numerous ways. They floated alternative theories, suggesting that perhaps someone else had been involved, that perhaps there was more to the story than what the prosecution was presenting. Forensic experts took the stand to explain the science behind the DNA evidence, detailing how the samples were collected, tested, and analyzed. The probability that the DNA belonged to someone other than Christina Morris was infinitesimally small, experts testified. The evidence was solid, and it pointed unambiguously to Christina having been in the trunk of Hiroki's vehicle. After more than 17 hours of deliberation, the jury reached a verdict. On September 20th, 2016, they found Enrique Hiroki guilty of aggravated kidnapping. The courtroom was filled with emotion as the verdict was read. The judge had instructed those present to remain silent and respectful, to avoid outbursts regardless of the outcome. As the words guilty were spoken, some family members wept quietly, others sat motionless, absorbing the moment. Hiroki was sentenced to life in prison, with eligibility for parole beginning in 2044, nearly 3 decades away. The conviction was groundbreaking in its own way. Prosecutor Zeke Fortenberry noted that it was one of the first cases in which someone had been convicted of aggravated kidnapping without a body or a definitively identified crime scene. The evidence had been strong enough to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that Christina Morris had been taken against her will, even though no one knew for certain where she had been taken or what had ultimately happened to her. Yet the conviction, while significant, did not bring the closure that Christina's family desperately sought. They still did not know where their daughter was. They could not hold a funeral, could not visit a grave, could not complete the painful rituals that help the living begin to heal. Every Saturday, Joni Hare, Mark Morris, and a dedicated group of volunteers met to search for Christina. They combed through fields, wooded areas, and rural stretches of land in North Texas, hoping that they might find some trace of her. The searches continued through 2015, 2016, and into 2017. The volunteers developed a bond forged by shared purpose and shared grief. They carried hope with them even as the months turned into years, even as the likelihood of finding Christina alive faded into the recognition that they were searching for her remains. On the morning of March 7, 2018, nearly 3.5 years after Christina disappeared, a construction crew was clearing brush for a new housing development in Anna, Texas, a small town north of Plano. Workers were excavating near a creek, removing trees and vegetation to prepare the land for building. Shortly before 10 in the morning, one of the workers noticed something that made him stop. There, partially concealed in the brush along a hillside, were human remains. The crew immediately contacted the authorities. Police from the Collin County Sheriff's Office and the Plano Police Department converged on the scene. Crime scene investigators carefully documented the area, collecting the skeletal remains and any items of clothing or personal effects that might help with identification. The location was significant. It was in an area that aligned with cell phone data, showing where Hiroki's phone had traveled on the morning Christina disappeared. The remains were transported to the Collin County Medical Examiner's office, where they were compared against Christina Morris's dental records and DNA profile, both of which had been on file since her disappearance. On March 8, 2018, the medical examiner confirmed what Christina's family and friends had both feared and hoped for. The remains were those of Christina Morris. Plano Police Chief Gregory Rushin held a press conference to announce the identification. Standing beside him were members of Christina's family, including her mother Joni Hare. Joni spoke briefly, her voice steady but filled with the weight of 2,185 days of searching and waiting. "This is the worst day of our lives," she said, acknowledging that while they had finally found Christina, the reality of her death was a pain that could never be fully measured. The family asked for privacy as they began the long process of grieving and healing, and they thanked the countless people who had searched for Christina, who had kept her story alive, and who had refused to give up hope. The discovery of Christina's remains brought a mixture of relief and renewed sorrow. There was relief in finally knowing where she was, in being able to bring her home and lay her to rest with dignity. But there was also the crushing finality of it. Christina was gone, her life cut short at 23, her future stolen by an act of violence that she did not deserve. The remains were found in a wooded area that volunteers had actually searched before, a reminder of how difficult such searches can be, and how easy it is for evidence to remain hidden even when people are looking. The location, close to where Hiroki's cell phone had pinged in the hours after Christina disappeared, added another piece to the puzzle. It suggested that Hiroki had driven to that area with Christina in his car, that he had left her there, and that he had then returned to Plano as if nothing had happened. While Hiroki had been convicted of aggravated kidnapping, the discovery of Christina's remains opened the possibility of additional charges, including murder. However, as of the time the remains were found, the investigation into the specifics of how Christina died had not been revisited with new charges. Hiroki continued to maintain his innocence, continuing to assert that he had not been responsible for Christina's disappearance or death, despite the overwhelming evidence against him. For the community of Plano, and for the many people who had followed Christina's case, the discovery of her remains was a moment of collective mourning. Vigils were held, and flowers were brought to the site where she was found. People who had never met Christina in life felt a connection to her story, moved by the tragedy of a young woman whose night out with friends had ended in such horror. Christina Morris's story is a painful reminder of how quickly safety can turn to danger, and how the people who harm us are often those we know, those we trust enough to walk beside in a parking garage in the early hours of the morning. It is a story about the determination of a family who refused to stop searching, about a community that came together to support them, and about the painstaking work of investigators who built a case strong enough to convict even without a body. It is also a story about a young woman whose life mattered, whose absence left a void in the lives of everyone who loved her. Christina was more than a headline, more than a case file. She was a daughter, a girlfriend, a friend. She had dreams and plans and a future that should have unfolded over decades. That future was taken from her in the worst possible way, and while justice was served in the form of a conviction, nothing can undo the loss or restore what was stolen from her and from those who loved her. Story 3. The evening of October 19th, 2022, arrived with a sense of urgency that filled the modest apartment in Santiago de Surco, a middle-class district on the southern edge of Lima, Peru. Inside the residence on Paseo Italia, Gabriela Olga Victoria Sevilla Torello, a 30-year-old woman, clutched her abdomen and told her mother that the contractions were intensifying. The water had broken, she said, and the time had come to meet her daughter, whom she had already named Martina. Her mother, Rita Torello, and her partner, Ramiro Galvez, prepared to rush her to the Clínica Internacional in San Borja, the medical facility where Gabriela claimed she had been receiving prenatal care. But then, inexplicably, Gabriela insisted she would go alone. Around 7 o'clock in the evening, Gabriela walked out into the street to hail a taxi. Before climbing into the vehicle, she performed a gesture that would later become a crucial detail in the unfolding drama. She snapped a photograph of the driver and sent it via WhatsApp to Ramiro. It was a precaution, the kind that women in Lima had learned to take in a city where disappearances were all too common. Then she settled into the back seat and told the driver her destination. Her mother headed separately to the clinic, expecting to meet her daughter there within the hour. But Gabriela Sevilla never arrived. When Rita Torello reached the Clínica Internacional and discovered that her daughter had not checked in, panic set in immediately. She tried calling Gabriela's phone repeatedly, but there was no answer. By 11 o'clock that night, Rita returned to the apartment in Surco with a growing sense of dread. Inside, she found what appeared to be confirmation of her worst fears. The floor was wet, as though amniotic fluid had pooled there. "We came back around 11 at night, and upstairs was wet. The liquid had fallen," Rita would later tell. The family filed a missing person report with the National Police of Peru, and by the morning of October 20th, Gabriela Sevilla's face was everywhere. Her photograph circulated across television news programs, radio broadcasts, and social media platforms. The story gripped the nation. A heavily pregnant woman on the verge of giving birth had vanished after boarding a taxi, leaving behind only a photograph of the driver and the chilling silence of an unanswered phone. The Ministry of Women and Vulnerable Populations became involved, as did the Ministry of the Interior. In a country where nearly 7,800 women had been reported missing in just the first 8 months of 2022, the urgency was palpable. For more than 30 hours, Peru held its breath. Volunteers shared Gabriela's image online, urging anyone with information to come forward. News anchors speculated about human trafficking rings that targeted pregnant women, a horrifying possibility that had been documented in other parts of Latin America. The nation's collective anxiety focused on a single question: where was Gabriela Sevilla, and where was her baby? At 4:55 in the morning on Friday, October 21st, the national police announced that Gabriella had been found. She had appeared in Villa Maria del Triunfo, a district adjacent to Surco, walking disoriented through the pre-dawn darkness. She arrived at the home of a relative, her face and body bearing what appeared to be signs of physical trauma, her words barely coherent. But there was one devastating detail that sent shockwaves through the country. Martina was not with her. Gabriella's father drove her to the Hospital Milita in Jesus Maria, where she was immediately examined by medical staff. As doctors conducted their evaluations, Gabriella began to tell her story to investigators. She said that after boarding the taxi, the driver had changed routes, taking her away from the clinic. She lost consciousness, she claimed, and when she awoke, she found herself in a dim room with 3 men standing over her. They forced her to give birth, she said, though she never heard her baby cry. Then she passed out again, and when she regained awareness, Martina was gone. According to Gabriella's account, a man dressed in white approached her and delivered a chilling ultimatum. If she spoke to the authorities, her parents would be killed. If she remained silent, they would return her daughter's body. Somehow, she said, her captors released her, and she wandered until she found her relative's home. The nation's horror deepened. The search intensified, not just for Gabriella now, but for baby Martina, an infant who had been stolen from her mother's arms in an act of unspeakable cruelty. Police mobilized resources to find the child. The media covered every development with breathless urgency. And then, at 10:15 in the morning on that same Friday, Minister of the Interior Willy Huerta made an announcement that would transform the entire case. Gabriella Sevilla, he said, had never been pregnant. The medical examinations conducted at the Hospital Milita had revealed an incontrovertible fact. Gabriella showed no clinical signs of gestation, no evidence of recent or past childbirth. Her uterus bore no traces of having carried a baby. The injuries she displayed were superficial and recent, but there were no signs that she had been drugged or subjected to the violence she described. The public prosecutor's office confirmed the findings. The young woman reported as missing does not present clinical signs of gestation, recent or old childbirth, although she does show recent traumatic body injuries. The revelation sent Peru reeling. If Gabriella had never been pregnant, then Martina did not exist. And if Martina did not exist, then what had happened during those 36 hours when the entire country had been searching for a missing mother and baby? That Friday afternoon, Gabriella left the Hospital Milita wrapped in blankets, surrounded by journalists and cameras. Her face was strained, her voice breaking as she insisted that she had been pregnant, that she had proof. "I have records of her heartbeats and ultrasounds," she told reporters. "How can they tell me it's not true?" She spoke of the pain of seeing her daughter's empty nursery, of the injustice of being doubted when she was the victim. She vowed to find Martina herself. But even as Gabriella spoke, investigators were uncovering a trail of deception that stretched back months. The key to understanding what had truly transpired lay with Ramiro Galvez, Gabriella's 36-year-old partner. The two had met in 2020 through the dating app Tinder, and Ramiro's family had initially found Gabriella to be charming and likable. They had formalized their relationship in 2021, but by the end of that year, they had separated. Then, several months later in 2022, Gabriella reappeared in Ramiro's life with unexpected news. She was pregnant with his child. Ramiro wanted to believe her. He made plans for the baby's arrival, purchased supplies, and prepared emotionally to become a father. But as the months passed, doubts began to creep in. Gabriella had told him the due date was late August 2022, but September arrived, then early October, with no signs of labor. She never showed him complete medical records, only a single gynecological report and a few ultrasound images. Growing increasingly suspicious, Ramiro decided to investigate. He contacted the Clínica Internacional in San Borja, the facility where Gabriella claimed to be receiving prenatal care. The records showed that while Gabriella had visited the clinic, none of her appointments had been related to pregnancy. She had received treatment for other medical issues, but there was no prenatal care documented. Then Ramiro took the gynecological report that Gabriela had provided and brought it to the doctor whose name appeared on the document. Dr. Aristoteles Logis examined the paper and immediately recognized that something was wrong. The document used his letterhead and appeared to bear his seal, but the registration number from the medical college was incorrect. "She falsified one of my documents," the doctor exclaimed. The code actually belonged to a specialist in aesthetic medicine, not to Dr. Logis. On the afternoon of October 18, 2022, the day before Gabriela's disappearance, Ramiro confronted her with his findings. He showed her the evidence that the medical documents were forged, that the clinics had no record of prenatal visits. Gabriela broke down in tears. The conversation was tense and painful, filled with accusations and denials. The next day, October 19th, Gabriela sent Ramiro a WhatsApp message insisting she was telling the truth. She claimed her water had broken and sent him a photograph of a bloodied towel as proof. She told him to meet her at the clinic. Then she vanished. As investigators pieced together the timeline, a troubling picture emerged. Video footage from the hospital Milita showed Gabriela arriving in the early hours of October 21st, walking at a brisk pace alongside her mother, showing no signs of physical distress or difficulty moving. For someone who claimed to have just given birth under duress and been subjected to violence, her mobility seemed remarkable. Detectives from the Criminal Investigation Directorate interviewed everyone involved. Gabriela's mother, Rita, had been instrumental in organizing the search effort, holding vigils and pleading for Martina's safe return. But Rita had known about the confrontation between Gabriela and Ramiro the day before the disappearance. She had been aware of the doubts surrounding the pregnancy, yet she had said nothing to authorities when her daughter vanished. Perhaps most tellingly, Gabriela herself never filed a formal police report about the alleged kidnapping of baby Martina. Despite claiming that her newborn daughter had been stolen by 3 men, despite describing in detail the room where she had supposedly given birth and the threats made against her family, Gabriela did not pursue an official investigation into the child's disappearance. Police confirmed that no such report existed. In the days following her reappearance, additional details surfaced that deepened the mystery. It was discovered that Gabriela had listed baby products for sale on Facebook Marketplace, items that were believed to be gifts from a baby shower. Why would a mother whose infant had been kidnapped be selling nursery supplies? The public prosecutor's office requested a psychological evaluation to determine whether Gabriela might be suffering from pseudocyesis, a rare condition in which a woman genuinely believes she is pregnant and may even experience physical symptoms such as nausea, cessation of menstruation, and breast changes. Another possibility was a delusional pregnancy, a psychological condition involving the conviction of being pregnant without accompanying physical symptoms. Mental health experts would need to assess whether Gabriela's actions stemmed from a psychiatric disorder or from deliberate deception. On July 6, 2023, nearly 9 months after the incident that captivated Peru, the Second Corporate Criminal Prosecutor's Office of Santiago de Surco, under the direction of Dr. Nilo Paredes Chavez, formally opened a criminal investigation against Gabriela Sevilla. She was to be charged with generic falsehood and falsification of documents. The investigation identified Ramiro Galvez as the aggrieved party. The prosecution's hypothesis held that Gabriela had never been pregnant and that her actions had caused both financial and emotional harm to her former partner. Ramiro had spent money preparing for a child that did not exist, purchasing clothes, furniture, and supplies. More significantly, he had suffered profound psychological distress upon learning that the pregnancy he had emotionally invested in was a fabrication. The charge of falsification of documents centered on the forged gynecological report that Gabriela had sent to Ramiro via WhatsApp. Dr. Aristoteles Logis had confirmed that while the document appeared to use his letterhead and seal, he had never signed it, and the medical college registration number was fraudulent. Creating and presenting such a document constituted a criminal offense under Peruvian law. The prosecutor's office set a 120-day timeline to complete its investigation. Gabriella's attorney stated that his client was receiving treatment related to the case, though he did not specify whether this was psychiatric care or some other form of intervention. If convicted of both charges, Gabriella could face up to 4 years in prison. In the months and years following the case, Gabriela Sevilla's story became emblematic of a troubling intersection between mental health, deception, and the exploitation of legitimate social concerns. Peru's serious problem with violence against women and the disappearance of thousands of women each year had created an environment where Gabriela's initial claims were taken with urgent seriousness. The system responded as it should have, mobilizing resources and public attention to find a woman believed to be in grave danger. But the revelation that the entire crisis had been fabricated sparked a backlash. On social media, some used the case to diminish concerns about gender-based violence, pointing to Gabriela's deception as evidence that women's reports of danger should be met with skepticism. Others speculated that she had orchestrated the entire scheme to trap Ramiro into staying with her, a theory that reflected deeply ingrained misogynistic assumptions about women's manipulation of pregnancy. Yet mental health professionals cautioned against rushing to judgment. If Gabriela was indeed suffering from pseudoseisis or another psychological condition, she would be a patient in need of treatment, not simply a criminal deserving punishment. The line between mental illness and criminal culpability is often blurred, and without the results of a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, it remained impossible to fully understand what had driven her actions. For Ramiro Galvez, the experience left deep scars. He had believed he was about to become a father, had prepared his life and heart for a child, only to discover that everything had been an illusion. The betrayal cut to the core of his ability to trust, not just in Gabriela, but in the fundamental honesty of human relationships. He had spent months caught between hope and doubt, seeking consultations with multiple gynecologists as the due date came and went, desperately wanting to believe Gabriela, even as evidence mounted against her. Gabriela's parents, who had initially defended their daughter's version of events with passionate conviction, retreated from public view after the truth emerged. The questions surrounding their role in the deception remained unanswered. Had they truly believed Gabriela was pregnant, or had they been complicit in maintaining the fiction? The extent of their knowledge and involvement remained unclear. As the investigation proceeded, fundamental questions about the case remained unresolved. What had Gabriela actually done during those 36 hours when the entire country believed she was missing? Had she inflicted the injuries on her own body, or had someone else been involved? If the pregnancy was a delusion stemming from mental illness, at what point did it transform into deliberate fraud when she began producing falsified medical documents? The photograph of the taxi driver, sent so carefully before she disappeared, suggested premeditation. It was a detail designed to add credibility to a kidnapping narrative, to make the story more believable. Similarly, the blood on the towel photographed and sent to Ramiro appeared to be a calculated attempt to provide physical evidence of labor. These were not the actions of someone lost in delusion, but of someone constructing a false reality and attempting to substantiate it with props and staging. Yet the question remained, why? If Gabriela knew she was not pregnant, what did she hope to achieve by disappearing and claiming her non-existent baby had been kidnapped? Did she believe that the public spectacle would somehow force Ramiro to recommit to their relationship? Did she think that once she reappeared, the story would simply fade away and she could claim a miscarriage or other explanation? Or had she become so entangled in her own web of lies that she saw no way forward except to create an even more elaborate fiction? The case of Gabriela Sevilla held up a mirror to Peruvian society, reflecting both its strengths and its vulnerabilities. The immediate, massive response to her disappearance demonstrated a collective commitment to protecting women and finding the missing. Within hours, her image had reached millions, and both government institutions and ordinary citizens had mobilized to help. This was the society at its best, responding with empathy and urgency to a person believed to be in danger. But the aftermath revealed the fragility of that solidarity. When the deception was exposed, the conversation shifted away from the genuine crisis of violence against women and toward questions of whether such reports could be trusted. The case became ammunition for those who wished to minimize or dismiss women's accounts of danger, a development that advocates for gender equality viewed with deep concern. Mental health experts used the case to highlight the need for better understanding and treatment of psychological disorders related to pregnancy and reproduction. Pseudocyesis and related conditions are rare but real, and women suffering from them require compassionate medical intervention, not criminal prosecution alone. The case raised questions about how the justice system should handle situations where mental illness and criminal behavior intersect. By early 2025, more than 2 years after the incident, questions about the final resolution of Gabriella's case persisted. Public interest had waned, and she had largely disappeared from media coverage. Whether she received psychiatric treatment, whether the criminal charges proceeded to trial, whether she was convicted or acquitted, these details remained obscure to the public that had once followed her story so intensely. What remained was the memory of those 36 hours when an entire nation held its breath, waiting for news of Gabriela Sevilla and baby Martina. It was a moment of collective anxiety and hope that ended not with relief, but with confusion and betrayal. The case served as a reminder that truth is often more complicated than it appears, that human psychology holds depths that defy easy explanation, and that the line between victim and perpetrator can sometimes blur in ways that challenge our understanding of justice, compassion, and accountability. Gabriela Sevilla's story, whether it was the product of mental illness or calculated deception, illuminated the profound power of a fabricated narrative to capture public attention and mobilize resources. It demonstrated how a single person's actions, driven by motives that may never be fully understood, could manipulate the emotions of millions and exploit genuine social concerns for personal ends. And it left behind a cautionary tale about the need to balance immediate, compassionate response to reports of danger with careful investigation of the facts, ensuring that neither skepticism nor credulity prevails at the expense of truth. Story 4. The afternoon sun hung high over Sarasota, Florida, on February 1st, 2004, casting the kind of bright winter light that made everything feel ordinary and safe. It was Super Bowl Sunday, and across the country, families were gathering in living rooms, preparing snacks, and anticipating the evening's big game between the New England Patriots and the Carolina Panthers. For 11-year-old Carly Jane Brucia, the day had been spent with a friend, enjoying the kind of carefree hours that define childhood. Now, as late afternoon approached, she was ready to head home to watch the game with her own family. Carly was a 6th grader with blonde hair that fell past her shoulders and a smile that lit up photographs. She was the kind of girl who loved spending time with friends, who laughed easily, and who had the sort of gentle spirit that made adults feel protective of her. Her mother, Susan Shorpen, and her stepfather, Steve Shorpen, were expecting her home. The walk from her friend's house to her own home was not long, and Carly had made similar trips before. She knew the neighborhood, knew the routes, and felt comfortable navigating the familiar streets of Sarasota. At around 6 o'clock in the evening, Carly said goodbye to her friend and began her walk home. She was wearing a yellow t-shirt with a design on the front, blue jeans, and white tennis shoes. She carried a few small items with her, and she walked with the unhurried pace of someone who had no reason to fear the world around her. The route she chose took her along streets lined with houses, businesses, and the occasional stretch of open parking lot. It was still daylight, and the streets were not entirely empty. To Carly, it must have seemed like any other walk home. But somewhere along that familiar route, Carly made a decision that would change everything. Whether it was to save time or simply because she knew the path well, she took a shortcut that led her through the parking lot of Evie's Car Wash, a small business located on Bee Ridge Road. The car wash sat on a corner, visible from the street, but also somewhat isolated, with a parking area that stretched behind the main building. It was the kind of place that people passed every day without giving it much thought, a mundane landmark in the fabric of the neighborhood. What Carly could not have known as she walked through that parking lot was that her movements were being watched. A man was there, his presence not immediately alarming in a public space where cars came and went throughout the day. He was not someone Carly recognized, not a neighbor or a friend's parent or anyone whose face she associated with safety. He was a stranger, and he had his own reasons for being there at that particular moment. The surveillance cameras mounted behind Evie's car wash were motion activated, designed to record activity in the parking area for security purposes. At approximately 6:21 in the evening, those cameras began recording. The footage they captured would become one of the most haunting and widely viewed pieces of evidence in a criminal case, a piece of video that would be broadcast across the nation and burned into the memory of everyone who saw it. The grainy black and white video showed Carly walking through the parking lot, her small figure moving from left to right across the screen. She appeared relaxed, unaware of any danger. Then, from the edge of the frame, a man entered the scene. He was dark-haired, dressed in dark clothing, and his arms were marked with visible tattoos. He walked toward Carly with what seemed like casual intent, as if he might simply pass by her. But at the last moment, he made a deliberate movement toward her. He reached out and grabbed her by the arm. The footage showed a brief interaction between the two. They appeared to exchange a few words, though no audio was recorded. Carly did not run or scream, at least not in a way that was visible on the silent video. The man held her arm firmly, and then he began to lead her away, out of the camera's view, toward the edge of the parking lot where other vehicles had been seen entering and leaving. Within moments, both of them disappeared from the frame. The entire encounter lasted less than a minute, but in that brief span of time, Carly Brucius' life was stolen from her. At home, Susan and Steve Shorpen began to worry when Carly did not arrive as expected. They knew the route she would take, and they knew how long it should take her to walk home. When the minutes stretched into an hour and Carly still had not appeared, their concern turned to alarm. Susan tried calling Carly's cell phone, but there was no answer. She contacted the friend's house where Carly had been, confirming that her daughter had left on time. By 7 o'clock, less than an hour after Carly should have arrived, Susan called the Sarasota Police Department to report her daughter missing. The police response was immediate. Officers understood that in cases involving missing children, every minute mattered. They began searching the route Carly would have taken, canvassing the area, knocking on doors, and asking residents if they had seen a young girl matching her description. Search dogs were brought in to try to track Carly's scent. The dogs led officers to the parking lot of Evie's car wash, where the trail abruptly stopped, as if Carly had vanished into thin air. Detectives spoke with the owner of the car wash, Mike Evanoff, asking if he had any surveillance footage from that evening. When Evanoff reviewed the tapes and saw what had been recorded, he immediately contacted the police. What they saw on that video confirmed their worst fears. Carly had not simply wandered off or gotten lost. She had been taken, abducted by a man whose face and actions were now captured on tape. The decision to release the surveillance footage to the public was made quickly. Law enforcement officials knew that someone somewhere might recognize the man in the video. The footage was broadcast on local news stations that evening, and by the next morning, it had spread to national networks. The image of a small girl being led away by a stranger in broad daylight struck a chord of horror and urgency across the country. People watched the video over and over, studying the man's appearance, his tattoos, the way he moved, hoping that someone would know who he was. Tips began pouring in almost immediately. The Sarasota Police Department was flooded with calls from people who thought they recognized the man in the video. Among those calls were at least 2 from individuals who knew Joseph P. Smith, a 37-year-old auto mechanic who lived in the Sarasota area. The callers said that the man in the surveillance footage looked like Smith, that the tattoos visible on his arms matched tattoos they had seen on him, and that his general appearance and build were consistent with the person they knew. Joseph Smith was not an unknown figure to law enforcement. He had a criminal history that stretched back more than a decade, with at least 13 arrests in Florida since 1993. His record included charges for drug possession, drug trafficking, theft, and other offenses. Most troubling of all, he had previously been charged with kidnapping and false imprisonment in an unrelated case, though he had been acquitted of those charges. At the time Carly disappeared, Smith was on probation following a prison sentence for drug-related crimes. He had been released from state prison just 13 months earlier, in January 2003. What made Smith's status even more disturbing was that his probation officer had recently asked a circuit judge to issue a warrant for his arrest due to a technical probation violation. Smith had failed to meet the requirements of his probation, but the judge had not yet acted on the request. If that warrant had been issued even a month earlier, Smith would have been in custody on February 1st, and Carly Brucia would likely have made it home safely. On February 3rd, 2 days after Carly disappeared, Smith was arrested on an unrelated parole violation. He was taken into custody and held at the Sarasota County Jail, unaware that he had already become the prime suspect in Carly's abduction. Detectives began investigating his movements on the evening of February 1st. They spoke with his coworkers, learning that Smith had failed to show up for his shift at the auto repair shop that day. Coworkers described him as struggling with drug addiction and financial problems, and they confirmed that he had access to a vehicle, though his usual car had been out of commission due to transmission issues. Investigators reviewed the surveillance footage again, this time looking at the vehicles that had been captured on camera around the time of Carly's abduction. One vehicle stood out, a pale yellow 1992 Buick Century station wagon that had pulled into the car wash parking lot approximately 3 minutes before Carly was grabbed. The car had appeared briefly, as if the driver was surveying the area, before it drove back out onto the road and stopped directly in front of the car wash entrance. Detectives believed this vehicle might belong to the abductor, and they worked to trace its ownership. While police gathered evidence, Carly's family and the entire Sarasota community waited in anguish. Susan Shorpen made tearful public pleas for her daughter's safe return. Vigils were held, and volunteers organized searches, combing through wooded areas, empty lots, and any place where a child might be hidden. The footage of Carly being led away played repeatedly on television, a constant, painful reminder of how vulnerable she had been and how quickly a normal day had turned into a nightmare. On February 5th, for days after Carly disappeared, Joseph Smith received a visit from his older brother, John Smith, and their mother, Patricia Davis. The visit took place in the Sarasota County Jail, where Joseph was being held on the probation violation. John and Patricia had seen the surveillance footage on the news, and they had their suspicions about Joseph's involvement. During the jail visit, they confronted him directly, asking him if he was the man in the video. Joseph Smith, emotional and weeping, confessed to his brother and mother that he was the person seen on the surveillance tape. He admitted that he had encountered Carly at the car wash, that he had taken her, and that he had physically assaulted her. He told them, through tears, that he had been heavily under the influence of drugs at the time, and that his memory of the events was foggy. He was not certain, he said, whether he had left Carly alive or whether he had killed her. The confession was devastating. Patricia Davis left the room crying, unable to bear what she was hearing. Joseph and John Smith embraced, both of them weeping as the weight of the truth settled over them. Joseph Smith provided his brother with information about where Carly's body might be found. He directed John to a church property not far from the car wash, describing landmarks such as a concrete structure and tree lines. After leaving the jail, John Smith and his mother drove to the area Joseph had described, searching for any sign of Carly. They did not find her body that day, and for several hours, John struggled with what to do. He later testified that he had hoped, perhaps irrationally, that Carly might still be alive. That night, John Smith contacted the authorities and told them what his brother had confessed. He led investigators to the location Joseph had described, a wooded area behind the Central Church of Christ on Proctor Road. The search began immediately, and on the morning of February 6, 2004, Carly Brucia's body was found. She was lying in the brush, partially concealed by vegetation. She was naked from the waist down, except for a sock that remained on one foot. The sight was heartbreaking and confirmed the worst fears of everyone who had been searching for her. The medical examiner's report revealed the full horror of what Carly had endured. She had been physically assaulted while she was still alive. The cause of death was determined to be strangulation. Joseph Smith had taken Carly from that parking lot, driven her to a secluded location, violated her in the most unimaginable way, and then ended her life by choking the breath from her small body. She had been 11 years old, with her whole life ahead of her, and she had been murdered by a man she did not know, a man who had been free to walk the streets despite a long history of criminal behavior. Joseph Smith was formally charged with first-degree murder, kidnapping, and capital sexual battery. The evidence against him was overwhelming. The surveillance footage showed him taking Carly. His own confession to his brother and mother left no doubt about his guilt. The physical evidence found at the scene and on Carly's body further corroborated the timeline and the nature of the crime. Smith pleaded not guilty, but few believed he had any chance of acquittal. The trial began in November 2005, nearly 2 years after Carly's death. The courtroom was filled with family members, community members, and reporters who had followed the case since that terrible day in February 2004. The prosecution presented the surveillance video, which jurors watched in silence, many of them visibly emotional as they saw Carly being led away. John Smith took the stand and recounted the jailhouse confession, his voice often faltering as he described his brother's admission of guilt. The medical examiner testified about the injuries Carly had sustained and the manner of her death. Each piece of evidence added to the overwhelming picture of Joseph Smith's guilt. The defense attempted to suggest that Smith's drug use had impaired his judgment and memory, but the evidence was too clear, too damning, to be explained away. On November 17, 2005, the jury found Joseph Smith guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, kidnapping, and capital sexual battery. The verdict was met with relief and sorrow. Carly's family had hoped for justice, and they had received it in the form of a guilty verdict, but no verdict could bring Carly back or erase the pain of her loss. During the penalty phase of the trial, the jury was tasked with deciding whether Joseph Smith should be sentenced to death or to life in prison without the possibility of parole. The jury voted 10-2 in favor of the death penalty, and the judge accepted the recommendation. In 2006, Joseph Smith was formally sentenced to death for the murder of Carly Brucia. The case had a profound impact beyond the courtroom. The nation had watched in horror as the surveillance footage aired repeatedly, and the circumstances of Carly's death highlighted failures in the criminal justice system. Joseph Smith had been on probation at the time of the murder, and a warrant for his arrest on a probation violation had been requested but not acted upon. If that warrant had been issued, Carly might still be alive. The case prompted widespread outrage and calls for reform. In response, Congress introduced legislation known as Carly's Law, sponsored by Representative Katherine Harris of Florida. The bill sought to tighten probation and parole requirements, to ensure that individuals who violated the terms of their release would be quickly returned to custody rather than allowed to remain free. While the legislation faced challenges and did not pass in its original form, it sparked important conversations about how the justice system handles offenders on probation and parole. Joseph Smith's death sentence was later overturned in 2018 due to a ruling by the Florida Supreme Court that required jury recommendations for the death penalty to be unanimous. Smith's jury had voted 10-2, which no longer met the legal standard. The case was set to be resentenced, and prosecutors indicated they would seek to have the death penalty reimposed. However, before a new sentencing hearing could take place, Joseph Smith died in prison on July 26, 2021. The cause of death was not immediately disclosed, but his death brought a form of closure to Carly's family and the community, ending years of legal proceedings and appeals. For Susan Shorpen and the rest of Carly's family, the years following her death were marked by profound grief. Susan struggled with the loss, and in later years, her own life was marked by hardship and tragedy. The pain of losing a child in such a horrific way is something that no parent should ever have to endure, and for Susan, that pain was compounded by the public nature of the case and the constant reminders of what had happened to her daughter. The case of Carly Brucia remains one of the most heartbreaking and widely remembered abduction and murder cases in recent American history. The surveillance footage of her being led away by Joseph Smith is an image that haunts anyone who has seen it, a stark reminder of how quickly innocence can be stolen and how vulnerable children are to those who mean them harm. Carly's story is not just about the crime that ended her life. It is also about the failures that allowed that crime to happen and the urgent need for a justice system that prioritizes public safety and the protection of the most vulnerable. Carly Brucia was a child who loved life, who had friends and family who adored her, and who should have grown up to experience all the joys and challenges of adolescence and adulthood. Instead, her life was cut short in the most violent and senseless way, and her name became synonymous with a tragedy that should never have occurred. The legacy of her case is a call to action, a reminder that society must do better to protect its children and to ensure that those who pose a danger are not allowed to roam free. Story 5. The quiet town of Enoch, Utah, had always been the kind of place where neighbors knew each other by name, where children played freely in the streets, and where the rhythm of life moved to the gentle pulse of community and faith. Nestled in the southwestern corner of the state, this small rural community of fewer than 8,000 souls rarely made headlines. But on a cold January afternoon in 2023, that tranquility shattered in a way that would forever mark the town and send shockwaves rippling across the nation. It began with a missed appointment. On the afternoon of January 4th, 2023, Tasha Haight, a 40-year-old mother of 5, failed to appear at a scheduled meeting. For those who knew her, this was immediately concerning. Tasha was reliable, organized, the kind of person who kept her commitments. When calls went unanswered and worry mounted, a family friend made the decision to check on the Haight household. What they found would haunt them forever. The friend arrived at the family's home in Enoch and noticed the door was open. Stepping inside, they encountered a scene of unimaginable horror. Throughout the house, in various bedrooms, lay the bodies of 8 people. The friend immediately called the police, their voice trembling with shock and disbelief. When officers arrived at 4 in the afternoon to conduct what should have been a routine welfare check, they confirmed the nightmare. Every member of the Haight family was dead, victims of gunshot wounds. The victims were identified as 42-year-old Michael Haight, his wife Tasha, her 78-year-old mother Gail Earl, and the couple's 5 children, 17-year-old Macy, 12-year-old Briley, 7-year-old twins Ammon and Sienna, and 4-year-old Gavin. As investigators began piecing together the tragedy, the grim reality emerged. This was not a random act of violence or a home invasion gone wrong. Michael Haight had systematically shot each member of his family before turning the gun on himself. To the outside world, the Haight family had seemed unremarkable in the best possible way. Michael worked as an insurance agent, having recently left his position with Allstate Insurance in Cedar City to attempt starting his own independent agency. Tasha was devoted to her children, managing the complex choreography of raising 5 kids with grace and determination. The children attended local schools, participated in community activities, and were described by neighbors as polite and well-mannered. On the surface, they appeared to be living the American dream in their quiet Utah town. But beneath that veneer of normalcy, darkness had been growing for years. The first documented warning signs emerged in 2020, 3 years before the tragedy, when 17-year-old Macy Haight gathered the courage to speak to police about her father. The teenager's statement to investigators painted a disturbing picture of life inside the Haight home. She told officers that her father had become increasingly aggressive toward her over the previous 3 years. The incidents had escalated from verbal abuse to physical violence. Macy described to police how her father had choked her during one terrifying encounter. She confessed to investigators that she lived in constant fear, worried that his attacks would continue to worsen. Most chilling of all, she told them she was very afraid that he was going to kill her. Despite this alarming report, which prompted an investigation by the Enoch Police Department, no charges were filed against Michael Haight. The family remained together, and the abuse continued behind closed doors. As 2022 drew to a close, the situation within the Haight household reached a critical juncture. After nearly 20 years of marriage, Tasha made the agonizing decision that she could no longer continue living with her husband. On December 21st, 2022, just days before Christmas, she filed for divorce in 5th District Court. The court immediately issued a domestic relations injunction, a standard protective measure that prohibited both parties from engaging in harassment, intimidation, domestic violence, or abuse against each other or their children. Tasha's mother, Gail Earle, recognized the danger her daughter faced and moved into the Haight home to provide support and protection during this volatile transition. Meanwhile, Michael was relegated to the basement, where he slept while his wife, mother-in-law, and children remained upstairs. The arrangement was meant to be temporary, a way to maintain some stability for the children while the divorce proceedings moved forward. In the 2 weeks between the divorce filing and the murders, Tasha met with her divorce attorney 3 times. She was taking concrete steps toward building a new life, one free from fear and control. But Michael was unraveling. He had recently lost his job with Allstate and was struggling to establish his independent agency. Now his wife was leaving him, taking the children, dismantling the family he claimed to cherish above all else. Newly released video footage and audio recordings from the night of January 3rd, 2023, provide a chilling window into the final hours before the massacre. The recordings, obtained through public records requests, captured conversations between Michael and Tasha that revealed the true dynamics of their relationship. Michael's voice, sometimes pleading and sometimes angry, demonstrated a pattern of manipulation and control that had characterized their marriage for years. In the videos, Michael repeatedly accused Tasha of turning their children against him. He claimed that she had been poisoning their relationship with their kids ever since she returned from a weekend trip with friends 2 months earlier. The children had become distant, he insisted, because of her manipulation, not because of his own abusive behavior. The irony seemed lost on him entirely. The conversations also exposed Michael's obsessive need to control the family's finances. Tasha confronted him about the restrictions he had placed on household spending, pointing out that despite his substantial income from Allstate, he had forced the family to live well below their means. She described how he had limited her to a budget of just $100 per person for Christmas gifts, then berated and belittled her over her spending, assuming she had exceeded the meager allowance he had imposed. At one point in the recordings, Michael appeared to cry as he pleaded with Tasha. His words painted him as the victim, trapped and cornered by an unreasonable wife. He claimed he would go to 20 counselors if necessary, that he would do anything to keep his family intact. But investigators who later reviewed the footage saw something different. They saw a man who had spent years controlling and abusing his family now losing that control, and his desperation was palpable and dangerous. Tasha, for her part, remained firm. She explained that she was pursuing divorce because she could no longer tolerate the way he treated her. She recalled a conversation from Thanksgiving, just weeks earlier, when Michael had refused to let her take a separate car to a family event despite her not feeling safe with him. Her words reflected years of accumulated hurt and fear, and a determination to finally break free. The night wore on. The household eventually grew quiet as everyone retired to their respective spaces. Michael, alone in the basement, faced a future that terrified him. His job was gone. His wife was leaving. His children, according to him, no longer loved him. In his distorted worldview, Tasha was responsible for all of it. She had manipulated, controlled, and destroyed everything he held dear. The reality that he had been the controlling and abusive one never seemed to penetrate his consciousness. Sometime around 3:30 in the morning on January 4th, a neighbor was awakened by a series of loud bangs. The sounds had an odd rhythm to them, like fireworks but with the cadence of gunshots. The neighbor listened, confused and half asleep, then eventually dismissed the noise and returned to bed. What they had heard was Michael Haight methodically moving through the house, room by room, ending the lives of everyone he claimed to love. The details of what happened in those dark morning hours remain almost too horrific to contemplate. Michael shot his mother-in-law, Gail Earle, who had traveled to Enoch specifically to protect her daughter and grandchildren. He shot his wife, Tasha, the woman he had spent 20 years controlling and who had finally found the strength to leave him. And then he shot his children, one by one. 4-year-old Gavin, still practically a baby, who should have had his whole life ahead of him. The 7-year-old twins, Ammon and Sienna, who shared that special bond that only twins understand. 12-year-old Briley, on the cusp of adolescence, full of potential and dreams. And finally, 17-year-old Macy, the brave teenager who had tried 3 years earlier to get help, who had told police she feared her father would kill her. Her worst nightmare had come true. After murdering his entire family, Michael Haight turned the gun on himself. When police arrived that afternoon, they found all 8 bodies scattered throughout the house. The investigation confirmed that Michael had died from a self-inflicted gunshot wound. He had chosen to destroy his family rather than lose control of them, and then he had chosen to escape the consequences of his actions through death. Among the evidence collected from the scene, investigators found a handwritten suicide note penned by Michael Haight. The letter provided a disturbing glimpse into his mindset in the hours before the killings. Even facing his final moments, Michael remained unable or unwilling to accept responsibility for his actions. Instead, his note blamed Tasha for everything. In the letter, Michael wrote that he would rather rot in hell than endure one more day of what he called manipulation and control. He claimed that he could not handle even one more day of the way Tasha treated him. He wrote that he and his family would not be a burden on society, a chilling statement that revealed his belief that he had the right to make life and death decisions for his wife and children. Most telling of all, he wrote that he had kept asking for help and that Tasha had refused to listen. The assertions in Michael's suicide note stood in stark contrast to the findings documented in the comprehensive 57-page police report. The investigation, which included interviews with family members, friends, neighbors, and a review of the couple's communications, painted an entirely different picture. The evidence overwhelmingly portrayed Michael as the controlling and abusive party, not his wife. His note was a final act of manipulation, an attempt to rewrite the narrative and cast himself as the victim, even as he committed an unspeakable act of violence against innocent people who could not defend themselves. The discovery of 8 bodies in a single home sent shockwaves through the tight-knit community of Enoch. Neighbors struggled to comprehend how such horror could occur in their quiet town. Many had known the family, had seen the children playing outside, had exchanged pleasantries with Michael and Tasha at community events. The realization that such darkness had existed just next door, hidden behind smiles and normalcy, left the community reeling. On January 13th, 2023, 9 days after the murders, a funeral service was held for the victims at La Verkin City Cemetery. All 7 members of the family who had been killed were buried together in a single service. Conspicuously absent from the ceremony was any mention of Michael Haight's name. He was given a separate, private funeral, an acknowledgement that while he had once been part of the family, his final actions had severed that bond irrevocably. In a statement released after the funeral, members of Tasha and Gail's extended family expressed their grief and also their forgiveness. They stated that despite the horror Michael had inflicted, they held no ill will toward the Haight side of the family. It was a remarkably gracious gesture in the face of unimaginable loss, a testament to the strength and character of those left behind to mourn. The tragedy also prompted broader conversations about domestic violence, warning signs, and the systems designed to protect victims. The fact that Macy Haight had reported her father's abuse to police 3 years before the murders, that an investigation had been conducted, and yet no meaningful intervention had occurred, raised painful questions. Could this tragedy have been prevented? Were there opportunities to step in and protect this family that were missed or ignored? The Haight family tragedy stands as a devastating reminder of the deadly consequences of domestic abuse and the particular danger posed when an abusive partner faces losing control. Statistics show that the most dangerous time for victims of domestic violence is when they attempt to leave the relationship. Precisely the situation Tasha found herself in during those final weeks of her life. Michael Haight's actions followed a pattern seen in other cases of familicide, where an abuser, unable to accept the dissolution of his family unit and the loss of his authority, chooses to destroy that family entirely rather than let it exist without him. The video footage from the night before the murders captured Michael claiming that he wanted his family more than anything, that he would do whatever it took to keep them together. But his words revealed a fundamental misunderstanding of what family actually means. He did not see his wife and children as autonomous individuals with their own rights, needs, and desires. Instead, he viewed them as extensions of himself, possessions he controlled. When that control was threatened, when Tasha asserted her independence by filing for divorce, his response was not to respect her choice, but to ensure that if he could not have his family, no one could. The case also highlights the insidious nature of coercive control in relationships. Michael's abuse was not limited to physical violence, though that was certainly present, as Macy's report to police made clear. He also exercised financial control, limiting what his family could spend while earning a substantial income. He isolated Tasha from support systems and made her feel responsible for the problems in their relationship. He manipulated the narrative, painting himself as the victim and his wife as the aggressor. This kind of psychological abuse can be just as damaging as physical violence, and it often goes unrecognized by those outside the relationship. The reaction of the community, filled with shock and grief, also revealed a common dynamic in cases like this. Many neighbors expressed disbelief, stating that they had never seen signs of trouble, that the family had seemed normal and happy. This disconnect between the public facade and the private reality is typical in abusive relationships. Abusers often present themselves as charming and likable to the outside world, while reserving their cruelty for behind closed doors. The isolation victims feel is compounded by the knowledge that no one would believe them if they spoke up, because the abuser seems so normal, so nice, so much like a good family man. In the case of the Haight family, there were people who knew. Macy had told police about the abuse. Family members were aware enough of the danger that Gail Earl moved into the home to protect her daughter. Tasha's divorce attorney understood the situation well enough to ensure she took protective steps. But somehow, the danger was not adequately assessed or addressed. Michael remained in the home, albeit in the basement. The systems designed to protect victims did not prevent this tragedy, and that failure weighs heavily on everyone involved. The deaths of Tasha Haight, Gail Earl, Macy Haight, Briley Haight, Ammon Haight, Sienna Haight, and Gavin Haight represent more than statistics in the grim tally of domestic violence fatalities. They were individuals with hopes, dreams, personalities, and potential. Tasha was a devoted mother, working to build a safer future for herself and her children. Gail was a grandmother willing to put herself in harm's way to protect her family. Macy was a brave young woman on the verge of adulthood who had tried to get help years before. Briley, Ammon, Sienna, and Gavin were children who should have grown up, gone to college, fallen in love, built careers, and had families of their own. The quiet town of Enoch will forever carry the weight of January 4th, 2023. The house where the murders occurred stands as a reminder of what was lost, of the 8 lives that ended too soon and too violently. Community members continue to grapple with how to remember the victims while processing the horror of how they died. Neighbors who heard those shots in the early morning darkness live with the knowledge of what those sounds really were. And across the country, the story of the Haight family serves as a tragic illustration of why domestic violence must be taken seriously, why warning signs must be heeded, and why victims need robust support and protection when they make the courageous decision to leave. The case also serves as a call to action for better identification and intervention in cases of domestic abuse, particularly when children are involved. The systems meant to protect vulnerable individuals failed the Haight family. Learning from that failure, improving response protocols, increasing resources for victims, and educating the public about the realities of domestic violence can help ensure that other families do not meet the same fate. In the end, the Haight family murder-suicide is a story about control, about abuse, about a man who valued his authority over his family more than he valued their lives or his own. It is about a woman who found the strength to leave a dangerous situation, but did not have enough time to escape. It is about children who deserve protection and did not receive it. And it is about a community forever changed by an act of violence that shattered the illusion that such horrors only happen somewhere else, to someone else. The names of Tasha, Gail, Macy, Briley, Ammon, Sienna, and Gavin deserve to be remembered not only for how they died, but for how they lived, and for the futures that were stolen from them on that cold January morning in Enoch, Utah. Story 6. The early summer air hung warm and heavy over Overland Park, Kansas, on the evening of June 2nd, 2007, as 18-year-old Kelsey and Smith backed out of her family's driveway with a heart full of excitement. It was a Saturday, and she had a simple mission that felt anything but ordinary. 6 months had passed since she and her boyfriend had started dating, and Kelsey wanted to mark the occasion with something special. She drove her Buick Regal through the familiar streets of her hometown, heading to the Target store where she planned to find the perfect gift. Kelsey was the kind of young woman who filled rooms with laughter and life, infectious personality, the way she could make anyone smile, and her surprising talent for belching louder than anyone at the dinner table after drinking a Coke, much to her mother Missy's mock horror. She was college-bound, her future bright and full of promise. She had 4 siblings who adored her, parents who cherished her, and a community that would soon learn just how deeply one person could touch the lives of so many. That Saturday evening, as she parked her Buick in the Target lot, she was simply a teenager celebrating a small milestone in the most ordinary way possible. What Kelsey didn't know as she stepped out of her car was that someone was watching. A white pickup truck had pulled into the parking lot shortly after her arrival, and a man in a white shirt had emerged from it with deliberate purpose. His name was Edwin Roy Hall, a 26-year-old from nearby Olathe, who had no significant criminal history beyond a trespassing charge and traffic violations. He was a father himself, often seen driving around with his young son in that same white truck, a detail that would later make neighbors shake their heads in disbelief. But on this particular evening, Hall was alone, and something dark and compulsive had taken hold of him. Hall followed Kelsey into the Target store, keeping a careful distance as she browsed the aisles. The store's surveillance cameras, more than 40 of them positioned throughout the building, captured every moment of what should have been an innocent shopping trip. Kelsey moved through the store unaware, selecting items for her boyfriend, her mind on the celebration ahead. She made her way to the checkout counter, paid for her purchases, and called her mother from inside the store to let her know she'd be home soon. It was the last conversation Kelsey would ever have with her family. As Kelsey completed her transaction and headed toward the exit, Hall moved too. He walked out of the store ahead of her, his steps purposeful, his mind set on a plan that would shatter countless lives. He returned to his truck and retrieved something he had brought with him, a gun. Then he waited, watching as Kelsey emerged from the store carrying her Target bags, her thoughts likely still on the anniversary surprise and the evening that stretched ahead. Kelsey walked to her car and opened the passenger side door to place her purchases inside. As she moved around to the driver's side to get in, Hall struck. He approached her at her most vulnerable moment, when she was focused on entering her vehicle, and he forced her into her own car at gunpoint. The cameras captured the violence of the encounter, though there were no obvious signs of a prolonged struggle. Hall's thumbprint would later be found on the back of the driver's seatbelt buckle, physical evidence of how he had controlled the terrified young woman. Kelsey's Buick left the Target parking lot, but it didn't go far. The vehicle was driven across the street to Oak Park Mall, where it was abandoned outside a Macy's store. For 2 hours, the car sat there in the gathering dusk while Hall took Kelsey somewhere else, somewhere far from the safety of the shopping centers and the busy streets of Overland Park. When investigators later examined the abandoned Buick, they found everything Kelsey had with her: her purse, her wallet, and the Target bags containing the gifts she had bought. Everything except Kelsey herself. Back at the Smith household, concern began to mount as the evening wore on and Kelsey didn't return home. She wasn't answering her phone. She wasn't responding to messages. This wasn't like her. Greg and Missy Smith, parents to 5 children, felt the first cold fingers of fear wrap around their hearts as the hours ticked by with no word from their daughter. When Kelsey's car was discovered in the Oak Park Mall parking lot around 9:17 that evening, approximately 4 hours after she had left Target, that fear transformed into something far worse. The Overland Park Police Department launched an immediate investigation, and the case quickly captured public attention. Surveillance footage became the primary lead, and investigators began the painstaking work of reviewing hours of video from Target's extensive camera system. The images they found told a chilling story of a predator stalking his prey through the aisles of a suburban store in broad daylight. The footage showed Hall following Kelsey, showed him leaving when she left, showed the moment her car was taken. As news of Kelsey's disappearance spread, the community responded with an outpouring of support. Volunteers organized search parties. Police received more than 500 tips from concerned citizens. The story made national headlines, appearing on programs like America's Most Wanted as the search for the missing teenager intensified. But as days passed with no sign of Kelsey, hope began to fade. The investigation hit a critical obstacle that would later change the way law enforcement responded to missing persons cases. Kelsey's cell phone could provide location data that might lead investigators to her, but accessing that information required cooperation from her service provider, Verizon Wireless. The company took 4 days to provide the crucial cell phone records, a delay attributed to privacy concerns and the technical limitations of accessing location data at that time. Verizon later explained that while their engineers had the technical capacity to identify a phone's specific location, that information wasn't readily available to the representatives contacted by police in the middle of the night. Those 4 days felt like an eternity for the Smith family. Greg and Missy clung to hope even as fear gnawed at them. They appeared on television, pleading for information, begging whoever had taken their daughter to let her come home. Their other children waited and worried. Friends and neighbors kept vigil. The entire community held its collective breath. On June 6, 2007, Verizon finally provided the location data that investigators desperately needed. A Verizon technician pinpointed a cell phone tower and told investigators to search 1.1 miles north of it. Within 45 minutes of receiving that information, at 1:30 in the afternoon, searchers made the discovery that everyone had been dreading. Kelsey's body lay in a wooded area near Longview Lake in Grandview, Missouri, approximately 18 to 20 miles from where she had been abducted. She had been found naked, her own belt wrapped around her neck. Her clothing lay nearby, stained with bleach in what appeared to be an attempt to destroy evidence. An autopsy would later confirm what investigators suspected. Kelsey had been subjected to a terrible ordeal before her death. She had been driven to those remote Missouri woods where Hall had committed unspeakable acts against her before strangling her with her own belt. The news hit the Smith family and the entire community like a physical blow. The young woman who had left home simply to buy an anniversary gift would never come home again. The future that had stretched before her, bright with promise and possibility, had been violently stolen. The grief was overwhelming, the loss incomprehensible. Even as the Smith family reeled from their loss, investigators were closing in on Edwin Hall. On the same day Kelsey's body was discovered, police arrested the 26-year-old. The evidence against him was substantial and damning. His thumbprint on Kelsey's seat belt buckle provided direct physical evidence placing him in her car. Kelsey's DNA was found on Hall's shorts, and a bloodstain belonging to her was discovered on his shoe. The surveillance footage showed him following her through Target and leaving when she left. When questioned by police, Hall initially denied any involvement in Kelsey's disappearance and murder, claiming he had only been at the target that day. But the physical evidence told a different story, one that Hall couldn't talk his way around. He was arraigned via video hookup on June 7th, with bonds set at $5 million. On August 1st, a Johnson County grand jury indicted him on charges of murder, rape, and aggravated sodomy, crimes that made him eligible for the death penalty. The legal proceedings that followed revealed the calculated nature of Hall's crime. Investigators believed he had spotted Kelsey as she drove into the Target parking lot. Seeing that she was alone, he had followed her inside to confirm she wasn't meeting anyone. When he saw her preparing to leave, he returned to his truck to retrieve his gun, and then waited for the perfect moment to strike. He had taken her 20 miles away to the isolated Missouri woods, where he could commit his crimes without fear of interruption. Afterward, he had attempted to destroy evidence with bleach, though his efforts proved insufficient to hide what he had done. District Attorney Phil Klein announced his intention to seek the death penalty, and the case moved toward what promised to be a lengthy and painful trial. The Smith family prepared themselves for the ordeal of court proceedings, for having to hear in excruciating detail what had happened to their daughter in her final hours. The entire community braced for a trial that would force everyone to confront the darkest aspects of human nature. On July 23, 2008, something unexpected happened. What was supposed to be a hearing about changing the trial venue turned into something else entirely. The courtroom was packed with Kelsey's family, friends, and reporters. All 4 of Kansas City's television network affiliates carried the proceedings live. And then Edwin Hall, 27 years old by this time, stood and pleaded guilty to all 4 charges: capital murder, aggravated kidnapping, rape, and aggravated sodomy. The plea agreement spared Hall from the death penalty, though he would never again know freedom. In exchange for his guilty plea, he would spend the rest of his life in prison without the possibility of parole. For the Smith family, the plea brought mixed emotions. There would be no trial, no need to endure months or years of legal proceedings. But there would also be no real answers to the questions that haunted them. Why had Hall chosen their daughter? What had driven him to commit such evil? At his sentencing hearing on September 16th, Hall offered words that felt inadequate in the face of what he had done. "I can't find the right words to say today," he said, his voice carrying to where the Smiths sat. "I am so sorry for what I have done. That's it. That's all I can say." Judge Peter V. Ruddick sentenced him to life in prison without parole, and Hall was taken to Lansing Correctional Facility in Lansing, Kansas, where he remains to this day. In the aftermath of their daughter's murder, Greg and Missy Smith could have retreated into private grief. No one would have blamed them if they had chosen to focus solely on healing their family and honoring Kelsey's memory in quiet ways. But the Smiths were determined that their daughter's death would not be meaningless. They channeled their grief into action, working to ensure that what happened to Kelsey might be prevented for other families in the future. The 4-day delay in obtaining Kelsey's cell phone location data had haunted investigators and the Smith family alike. Those were 4 days during which Kelsey might have been found alive, for days that could have made all the difference. While her body was discovered within 45 minutes of authorities finally receiving the location information, she had been dead for days by that point. The Smiths became advocates for legislation that would change how quickly cell phone companies must provide location data to law enforcement in emergency situations. The result of their advocacy became known as the Kelsey-Smith Act, legislation that requires cell phone carriers to provide location information to law enforcement officials in emergency situations involving risk of death or serious physical harm. The act includes provisions to protect consumer privacy, requiring that customers be notified within 30 days if their phone has been pinged to help locate a missing person. It also provides cell phone companies with civil and criminal liability protection for providing location information in good faith. Multiple states passed versions of the Kelsey-Smith Act, and the legislation continues to be proposed and debated at both state and federal levels. The law represents a careful balance between the operational needs of law enforcement in emergency situations and the privacy rights of cell phone users. It stands as a testament to the Smith family's determination to find meaning in tragedy, to ensure that their daughter's name would be associated not just with loss, but with positive change. The Smith family has worked hard to keep Kelsey's memory alive in ways that honor the vibrant young woman she was, not just the victim she became. They talk about her passion for life, her sense of humor, her ability to make everyone around her feel special. They share stories about her quirks and her laughter, about the ordinary moments that make up a life. "We're still just parents," Greg Smith said in an interview. "We have 4 other kids, and we try to do the best we can to be parents. We're still Kelsey's parents." The tragedy of Kelsey Smith's death resonates because it could have happened to anyone. She wasn't engaged in risky behavior. She wasn't in a dangerous part of town at a dangerous time. She was simply shopping at Target on a Saturday evening, doing something millions of people do without a second thought. The randomness of her selection by Edwin Hall, the calculated nature of his stalking, the vulnerability of that moment in the parking lot, all of it serves as a stark reminder of how quickly ordinary life can be shattered by violence. The case also highlights the importance of surveillance technology and rapid access to location data in solving crimes and potentially saving lives. The Target surveillance footage provided crucial evidence that identified Hall and documented his stalking behavior. The cell phone location data, once finally obtained, led directly to Kelsey's body and provided investigators with key information for building their case. These tools have become increasingly important in modern law enforcement, even as questions about privacy and civil liberties continue to be debated. 15 years after Kelsey's murder, her family reflected on her enduring impact. Her name continues to resonate across Kansas City and beyond, associated with both heartbreaking loss and meaningful change. The Kelsey Smith Act has helped law enforcement agencies respond more quickly to emergencies, potentially saving lives. The foundation bearing her name continues its work of education and support, and the Smith family carries on, forever changed by what happened, but determined to keep moving forward while honoring Kelsey's memory. The woods near Longview Lake, where Kelsey's body was found, are peaceful now, far removed from the violence that occurred there on that June evening in 2007. The Target parking lot in Overland Park continues to fill with shoppers going about their ordinary errands. Life goes on, as it must, but the memory of what happened to Kelsey Smith serves as a reminder of the preciousness of every ordinary moment, and of the importance of staying vigilant even in the most familiar surroundings. For Greg and Missy Smith, and for Kelsey's siblings, the pain of her loss never truly fades. But alongside that pain lives the determination to keep Kelsey's spirit alive through positive action, through advocacy, through refusing to let her be forgotten. They have taken the worst moment of their lives and transformed it into a legacy of change and awareness. It's what they believe Kelsey would have wanted, for her story to help others, for her name to mean something beyond the tragedy. Kelsey Ann Smith was 18 years old when her life was stolen from her. She was a daughter, a sister, a girlfriend, a friend. She had dreams and plans and a future that should have unfolded over decades. Instead, her life became a cautionary tale and a catalyst for change. She deserved so much more than what happened to her in those woods by the lake. But through the work of her family and the legislation that bears her name, Kelsey's impact continues to be felt. She may be gone, but she is not forgotten. And in that remembrance, in that refusal to let her story end with her death, there is a kind of justice, imperfect, incomplete, but real nonetheless. Story 7. The summer of 2011 in Macon, Georgia, carried the heavy scent of magnolias and the hum of cicadas, a familiar rhythm for a small city where life moved slowly under the weight of southern heat. On June 26th, Lauren Giddings, a 27-year-old law school graduate, was preparing for the next chapter of her life. Her apartment at the Barristers Hall complex, a red brick building just steps from Mercer University's law school, was a cozy space filled with books, running shoes, and the quiet ambition of a young woman on the cusp of her career. Lauren was striking, blonde, athletic, with a warm smile that put people at ease. She had graduated from Mercer's Walter F. George School of Law in May, passed the Georgia bar exam, and was planning to move back to her home state of Maryland to start a new job. That morning, she chatted with her boyfriend, David, over the phone, her voice bright with plans for the future. She mentioned running errands, maybe hitting the gym, her usual routine. But when David tried calling her later that day, the line went unanswered. By June 30th, when her friends hadn't heard from her, a creeping unease settled over them. Lauren wasn't the type to disappear. Caitlin Wheeler, Lauren's close friend and fellow law school graduate, lived in the same apartment complex. She stood outside Lauren's ground floor unit, knocking on the door, her heart pounding as silence greeted her. Caitlin's dark hair was pulled back, her face etched with worry. She called Lauren's sister, Katie, in Maryland, and together they contacted the Macon Police Department. Officers arrived at Barristers Hall, a place where law students lived in tight-knit community, their lives intertwined by late-night study sessions and shared dreams. The door to Lauren's apartment was locked, the windows secure, but something felt wrong. When police entered, they found an eerie stillness. Lauren's purse, keys, and cell phone were gone, but her laptop sat open on the desk, a half-finished email on the screen. Her running shoes, usually by the door, were missing. To the officers, it looked like she'd stepped out briefly, perhaps for a jog. But Caitlin knew better. She wouldn't just leave, she told Detective David Patterson, her voice trembling. Something's happened. The police launched a search, canvassing the neighborhood and questioning residents. Macon, with its population of 90,000, was a city where violent crime wasn't uncommon, but Barristers Hall felt like a safe haven, a bubble for ambitious young lawyers. Volunteers, including Lauren's classmates, fanned out across the city, posting flyers with her photo, a smiling young woman with bright eyes and a determined jaw. The local news, including WMAZ-TV, ran stories, and posts on social media platforms like X reflected growing concern. "Please help find Lauren Giddings," one user wrote, sharing her picture. "She's one of us." The community rallied, but the days dragged on with no sign of her. Lauren's parents, Bill and Karen Giddings, arrived from Maryland, their faces drawn with fear. Bill, a soft-spoken engineer, clutched a photo of Lauren from her graduation, while Karen, a nurse, tried to stay composed, her hands trembling as she spoke to reporters. "She's our baby," Karen said, her voice breaking. "We just want her home." Detective David Patterson, a veteran of the Macon Police Department with a reputation for tenacity, stood in Lauren's apartment on July 1st, his eyes scanning every detail. The place was tidy, almost too tidy, as if someone had been careful not to disturb it. Patterson, a broad-shouldered man with a calm demeanor, had seen enough missing persons cases to know they often hid darker truths. He interviewed neighbors, including Stephen McDaniel, a 25-year-old law school classmate who lived in the apartment next to Lauren's. Stephen was lanky, with pale skin and dark, intense eyes hidden behind glasses. He was quiet, awkward, but eager to help, joining search parties and speaking to reporters with a nervous sincerity. "She was my friend," he told WMAZ-TV, his voice cracking as he described Lauren's kindness. "I just want her to be okay." Patterson noted his demeanor, overly eager perhaps, but not unusual for a concerned neighbor. The breakthrough came on June 30th, when a maintenance worker at Barristers Hall found a gruesome clue in a dumpster behind the complex. A human torso, wrapped in plastic garbage bags. The discovery sent shockwaves through Macon. Patterson, called to the scene, felt his stomach churn as he peered into the dumpster, the stench of decay overwhelming in the Georgia heat. The torso was female, dismembered with surgical precision, the limbs and head missing. Forensic pathologist Dr. Amy Burroughs Beckham was summoned, her face grim as she examined the remains. "This wasn't random," she told Patterson, her voice steady. "Whoever did this took their time." DNA testing confirmed the worst. The torso belonged to Lauren Giddings. The news hit her family like a tidal wave. Karen collapsed, sobbing, while Bill stood frozen, his hands clenched into fists. Caitlin, who had been holding out hope, sat in her apartment, staring at the wall, unable to process the loss of her friend. The investigation shifted from a missing persons case to a homicide. Patterson and his partner, Detective Robert Williams, scoured the area for the rest of Lauren's remains, but the search yielded nothing. The dumpster, located just yards from her apartment, suggested the killer was close. Someone who knew the complex, its routines, its blind spots. The police interviewed every resident, focusing on those closest to Lauren. Stephen McDaniel, as her next-door neighbor, was questioned again. He was cooperative, providing a detailed account of his movements, studying for the bar exam, attending a study group, searching for Lauren with friends. But something about him nagged at Patterson. His answers were too rehearsed, his emotions too performative. "He's hiding something," Patterson told Williams, his voice low. "I can feel it." The case took a chilling turn on July 2nd, when police searched Stephen McDaniel's apartment. The unit, adjacent to Lauren's, was cluttered with law books, empty soda cans, and a faint musty smell. In a closet, hidden behind a stack of clothes, detectives found a hacksaw with traces of blood and tissue later matched to Lauren. A search of his computer revealed a chilling detail. Stephen had used a master key, obtained from a maintenance worker, to enter Lauren's apartment multiple times in the weeks before her disappearance. Surveillance footage from a nearby camera showed him lurking outside her window at night, his figure a shadow in the grainy feed. Most damning was a memory stick, tucked in a drawer, containing videos of Lauren, some filmed without her knowledge through her window. The footage showed her exercising, studying, unaware of the eyes watching her. Patterson felt a chill run down his spine. He was obsessed, he told Williams, his voice tight with anger. Stephen was arrested on July 3, 2011, charged initially with burglary for stealing a condom from another neighbor's apartment, a minor charge to hold him while prosecutors built the murder case. Macon was stunned. Stephen, a Mercer Law student with a quiet demeanor, didn't fit the image of a killer. His parents, Mark and Janet McDaniel, were devastated, insisting their son was incapable of such a crime. "He's a good boy," Janet told reporters, her voice trembling. "He loved Lauren." But the evidence was mounting. Forensic analysis of Stephen's computer revealed searches for violent pornography and articles on dismemberment, dated weeks before Lauren's death. A luminol test in his bathroom showed traces of blood, though not enough to conclusively tie it to Lauren. The hacksaw, however, was undeniable, its blade bearing her DNA. Lauren Giddings had been a beacon of light in Macon. Born in 1984 in Tacoma Park, Maryland, she was the youngest of Bill and Karen's 3 daughters. She was athletic, running cross-country in high school, and fiercely intelligent, graduating with honors from Agnes Scott College before enrolling at Mercer. At law school, she was a star, serving as president of the Student Bar Association and earning a reputation for her warmth and dedication. She volunteered at a local legal aid clinic, helping low-income families, and dreamed of a career in public interest law. Her boyfriend, David, a law school classmate, described her as his anchor, the person who made him believe in a better world. "She was fearless," he said, his voice breaking during a memorial service. "She saw the good in everyone." Stephen McDaniel, by contrast, was an enigma. Born in 1986 in Lilburn, Georgia, he was a shy, studious boy who excelled academically but struggled socially. At Mercer, he was known as a loner, often seen studying alone in the library. Classmates described him as awkward, his attempts at humor falling flat. He had developed a fixation on Lauren, who had been kind to him as a neighbor, inviting him to study groups and offering friendly smiles. But her kindness, prosecutors later argued, was mistaken for affection, fueling an obsession that turned deadly. He wanted her, and when he couldn't have her, he destroyed her. Assistant District Attorney Nancy Malker told her team, her voice firm with resolve. The investigation deepened. On July 5th, police found a pair of Lauren's running shoes in a dumpster at a nearby apartment complex, along with a blood-stained sheet. The items were traced back to Stephen through receipts found in his apartment, showing he'd purchased the same brand of garbage bags used to wrap Lauren's torso. The rest of her remains, her head, arms, and legs, were never found, despite extensive searches of local landfills, rivers, and wooded areas. Prosecutors believed Stephen had scattered them to prevent identification, a calculated move to cover his tracks. His confession, obtained after hours of interrogation, was partial and evasive. He admitted to entering Lauren's apartment on June 26th, claiming he found her dead, possibly from a drug overdose, and panicked. He said he dismembered her body to make it easier to dispose of, but denied killing her. Patterson didn't buy it. "He's lying," he told Malker. "The evidence tells a different story." The case gripped Macon, dominating headlines in the Telegraph and drawing national attention from outlets like CNN and the New York Times. The murder of a promising young lawyer, committed by one of her own classmates, was a story of betrayal and loss that resonated deeply. Vigils were held at Mercer, where students lit candles and shared memories of Lauren's laugh, her determination, her grace. On X, posts reflected the community's grief and outrage. "Lauren Giddings deserved so much more," one user wrote. "How could someone she trusted do this?" The law school, shaken by the loss, established a scholarship in Lauren's name, honoring her commitment to justice. The trial began on August 20th, 2012, in Bibb County Superior Court, Judge S. Philip Brown presiding. The courtroom was packed, with Lauren's family seated in the front row, their faces etched with pain. Stephen, now 26, sat at the defense table, his glasses reflecting the courtroom lights, his expression blank. Prosecutor Nancy Malker presented a meticulous case, weaving together the physical evidence, the hacksaw, the blood traces, the surveillance footage, with Stephen's obsession, documented through his videos and computer searches. "This was not a panicked act," she told the jury, her voice steady. "This was planned, deliberate, and cruel." She described how Stephen likely entered Lauren's apartment in the early hours of June 26th, using the master key, and strangled her as she slept. The dismemberment, she argued, was his attempt to erase her, to reduce her to nothing. The defense, led by attorney Franklin Hogue, argued that Stephen was not a murderer, but a disturbed young man who made a terrible mistake. They claimed Lauren's death was accidental, possibly drug-related, and that Stephen's actions afterward were driven by fear, not malice. Hogue challenged the lack of direct evidence: no eyewitnesses, no murder weapon beyond the hacksaw, no conclusive proof of how Lauren died. But the jury, a mix of Macon residents, was swayed by the prosecution's narrative. The surveillance footage, showing Stephen's nocturnal prowling, was particularly damning, as were the videos on his memory stick, which painted a picture of a man consumed by unhealthy fixation. On August 27, 2012, after 2 days of deliberation, the jury found Stephen McDaniel guilty of murder. The courtroom was silent as Judge Brown sentenced him to life in prison without parole. Lauren's family wept, holding each other tightly, while Stephen showed no emotion, his eyes fixed on the floor. Karen Giddings, in her victim impact statement, spoke directly to him. "You took our daughter, our sister, our light," she said, her voice trembling but resolute. "You'll never take her memory." The words hung in the air, a testament to a grief that would never fade. The aftermath of the trial left Macon changed. Barristers' Hall, once a lively hub for law students, felt haunted, its hallways quieter, its residents more guarded. Lauren's friends, including Caitlin, struggled to move forward, their futures in law now shadowed by loss. The Giddings family returned to Maryland, where they kept Lauren's room untouched, her running medals displayed on a shelf, her law degree framed on the wall. Bill and Karen became advocates for victim rights, speaking at community events about the need for justice and healing. "Lauren's life meant something," Bill said at a memorial, his voice steady. "We'll make sure it continues to mean something." Stephen McDaniel, now 39, remains at Hancock State Prison, his appeals for a new trial denied. His parents, still grappling with their son's actions, visit him when they can, their faith tested by the weight of his crime. The case prompted changes at Mercer, with increased security at student housing and new protocols for reporting suspicious behavior. The community, though scarred, found ways to honor Lauren. A local running trail was named in her memory, a place where joggers could feel her spirit in the breeze. The murder of Lauren Giddings became a cautionary tale, a reminder of the darkness that can hide behind a familiar face. It exposed the fragility of trust, the pain of betrayal, and the enduring power of a community's love for one of its own. In Macon, the magnolias still bloom, their petals falling gently to the ground, but for those who knew Lauren, her absence is a wound that time cannot fully heal. Her story lives on, a call to cherish life, to seek justice, and to never forget the light she brought to the world.